I think that in the next 5 years, I think year by year, we're going to go through a time warp. You're going to see radical disorder in the next 5 years as each one of those things comes to pass. First with the elections as we have, then we have the conflict with the geopolitical conflict, then we have the climate issue, which, by the way, is a very expensive issue. We should talk about how costly that issue is. And then we're going to have this issue of technology, which can provide the greatest miracle, but also is a weapon.
Let's now look at the typical sequence of events going on inside a country that produces these rises and declines. In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict, often a war, establishes the new leading power and the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing. They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. The empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency, which leads to even more borrowing. At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly, so the wealth gap typically grows between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Eventually, the financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money, an increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth. This can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict, its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power gets strong enough to compete with the dominant power that is having domestic breakdowns, external conflicts, most typically wars, take place. Out of these internal and external wars come new winners and losers. Then the winners get together to create the new world order, and the cycle begins again.
So 3 things started to happen in my lifetime, our lifetimes, that never happened before, and I needed therefore to study them in history. The first is the amount of debt and money creation. Huge amounts of debt and money creation. Does that matter? What is the rise and decline of a reserve currency? How does that all work? I needed to see the cycles for that. The second was the amount of internal political conflict, in particular populism of the left and populism of the right. And a populist is a person who will not accept losing. They fight with their contingency, and that dysfunction and that lack of willingness to lose then had January 6th came out after the book, and there's a dynamic that we're going on for that. And the third, of course, is the great power conflict. In other words, the rise of a comparable economic and military power in the form of China rising and competing with the United States, which is also changing that world order. Those 3 things never happened in my lifetime, but are big things that are affecting things. When I went back in history, I said I needed to study how these things work. Sometimes we overlook the really big things. So I went back and I studied that, and I saw that there were 2 others that had enormous impact. The 2 others were acts of nature, in particular droughts, floods, and pandemics. And they killed more people, and they toppled more empires and changed more world orders than anything. And certainly, big issue. Now, and then number 5 is technological changes and how they evolve. So I needed to study those 5 forces. I saw that there's this cycle that repeats over for good cause-effect relationships. I don't believe in a cycle just because it repeats. I started to understand the cause-effect relationships. For any country, and quite often many countries, because they go through the cycle together, as they did in the 30s, what happens is debt rises relative to incomes. And what that means mechanistically is that debt service payments rise relative to incomes. And so it squeezes out consumption as this compounds. And what happens is there's a realization that they have to print money. So I think you're going to see in the next downturn another move to print money. There are certain things that are going on now that means that the big risk comes when they don't want to hold those bonds anymore, okay? Because the supply demand, think about that supply demand. It has a deficit, it has to borrow, and so it sells its bonds. Who are the buyers of the bonds? Why do they buy? The buyers of the bonds buy because there's an attractive return. Not only do you have to sell those amounts of bonds, but when they start to realize that I'm not getting good returns on those bonds, they can sell those bonds. There are $31 trillion of bonds.
What would they own instead?
They always own tangible things, and those things can also be, it could be equities, it could be many other things. It could be gold, okay? Gold has always been accepted as a money because it's nobody else's. There's a saying, gold is the only asset you can have, that not somebody else's liability. In other words, you're dependent on getting paid. Right. You can have that at intrinsic value, and for a long period of time, it's been valued, and you can move it between countries. But also, different countries prosper. So you'll see some of the countries that we mentioned, they will prosper through that.
So Ray, I think I fundamentally agree with your critique that America is looking more and more like a late stage empire. Like a late stage Roman Empire, we have this massive debt and we're debasing our currency. Like the Roman Empire, we have all these, far-flung military wars, which we lose, all over the world. We're racked by internal division. So I think I agree with that part of it. At the same time, we do seem to be really good still at technological innovation. In the last year, we've had this breakthrough with, AI, with large language models. I'm wondering, well, first of all, is that a mirage, or do you agree with that? And then if you do agree that we're still really good at technology, is there anything in the historical pattern that's like that, where you have an empire that's declining in every visible way, except for the one that really undergirds our power, which is technology?
Well, the late 20s in the United States is such a good classic example. We had more innovations, more all of these cycles. If I was to go back to the Industrial Revolution, late 1800s, and then you create, when there's a lot of debt and a big wealth gap, you have in 1907, you have the panic of 1907. Boom! You have you have this internal conflict, and you had the First World War. In the 20s, you had the same kind of late 20s. It was an era of great inventiveness. The other things matter.
So just because we're really great at innovation isn't going to save us if all these other things are broken.
It's a wonderful thing, but ultimately, we as a society, in an aggregate, are spending a lot more money than we're earning. So if we're doing such a good job on that technology or whatever it is, why is that happening? Okay, so now when you look at the debt, do you want to own the debt? Do you want to own that? When those who don't want to own it, then you have a financial problem. When you have a financial problem at the same time as you have a wealth gap and populism, that's a dangerous combination.